Luckman, Murder Incorporated, and the Rise of the Modern NFL. Came out a year or so ago, Atlantic Press, I believe it was. And our good buddy is Richard Rosen, Atlantic Monthly Press, who wrote this book. We tracked him. That took us forever, but we found him. I somehow found this book last week. I had Eddie. I said, Eddie, you got to get me a copy. You know me, I love this stuff. Eddie gets me a copy. I read it, finished it last night. It is a wonderful book, and I learned a hell of a lot about the 40s in the NFL and about Murder Incorporated and the Jewish mob in Brooklyn. And we'll get to that as we'll go sort of back and forth here with Richard. All right, Richard, let's talk about Luckman as player now in his career. Goes to Columbia. There in the mid-30s, where Erasmus Hall first, great player. Goes to Columbia, right. Good photo, by the way, in there at Erasmus Hall. Goes to Columbia, plays for Lou Little, famous coach. Bad team, right. But he is something special to watch. Hallis finds him. Goes to a ball game, sees him. I think the game they lost, and they were so impressed with how he managed the game and his toughness. He drafts him, and he ends up in Chicago in the late 30s. Now, that's one thing that's interesting, but the more important aspect of this is what you hinted a second ago, Hallis and Shaughnessy, the T formation. Let's talk about that for a second. That's a big part of this book, is the modern T formation and how Luckman maximized his abilities with it and won some championships. Let's go there first. Go ahead.
Okay, let's go there. The T formation had existed in some primordial form in the 19th century, but it wasn't a passing offense because people really didn't pass the ball. And even into the 30s, the passing was a very small part of the offense. And there is a reason for it, if I can digress already, that I didn't know. And I was talking to Marv Levy, the great Hall of Fame coach, and he didn't know this. That is that the reason passing took off as a component of the offense was that in 1935, the league reduced the size of the ball, reduced the circumference of the ball by about an inch. And that was enough to give a man's hand much more control. Now you could really throw overhand, you could really spin the ball. And in 1935, they changed the size of the ball. And as you may remember, Don Hudson of Green Bay came into the league in that year and began catching one pass after another. He was the first beneficiary of this smaller ball. Then in 1937, the Washington Redskins drafted Sammy Baugh out of Texas Christian. And in his rookie year, Baugh and the Redskins faced the Bears in Wrigley Field in 1937. And in the second half, Baugh broke the game open by throwing 3 long touchdown passes on a really rough, icy field. And Hallis, who of course had founded the Bears in 1921, he needed Sammy Baugh. In 1938, he was looking around for his Sammy Baugh because he saw what had happened in Green Bay and now Washington. If he was going to be competitive, he needed a passer. And he heard from Lou Little. Lou Little said, "I got this guy here. You got to see him. He's great. He's great. He's really a leader on the field. He's so smart." And Hallis was in New York in the fall of 38 to play the Giants. And the day before, he went up to Baker Field and he watched Sid in the rain play Syracuse. Syracuse won 13-12. They were a much better team. But Hallis was so impressed by the way Sid handled the ball in the rain and the muck and how tough he was that he drafted him. But Sid had no confidence in himself. I mean, he played for a mediocre Columbia team. And Hallis tried to convince him to come, saying, "Look, Clark Shaughnessy, who was a game changer. He had gone to Hallis when he was coaching at the University of Chicago and said, 'I've got an idea, George.' And on a napkin, he sketched out a new kind of offense where the quarterback was right over the center, 3 backs in a line behind them. And that offense needed a quarterback who could handle the ball, who could fake, who could bootleg, who could pivot, and who could memorize, 500 plays in the Bears playbook. And Hallis thought that Luckman was it. But Luckman had a few problems. One, he didn't have great confidence. 2, he thought he was too small to play in the pros, although he was 5'11", about 190. So that was pretty big for that time. And 3, his father had been in prison for the last 2.5 years. Sid and his family had been through hell. Hell. The story of Sid murdering his own brother-in-law had made headlines in New York for weeks and months and kept coming back because there was another trial and there's more discovery. Turned out that Sid's father was actually much more mobbed up than anybody knew. And Sid had sat in the courtroom in the murder trial and heard his own grandfather, that is the father of the victim, take the stand and in Yiddish, because he didn't speak English, point at Sid's father, Meyer Luckman, and said, "You killed my son," in Yiddish. "You murdered my son." And the son had been Sid's favorite uncle. So it's a family disaster of unbelievable proportions.
Wow. He sure is.
That's what Sid had gone through. So he wanted to stay close to his mother. He wanted to help his older brother take over the father's trucking business because they had to support the family. Now his father was sitting up the river. So he kept saying, "No, Mr. Hallis, I appreciate your interest." There's some wonderful letters. Sid wrote, "I really appreciate your interest, that you have this confidence in me, but I really got to stay in New York." And Hallis came to New York and had dinner at Sid's apartment in the summer of '39. So Sid is about to enter the trucking business. He's graduated from Columbia. And Sid is offered a $4,000 contract to come play for the Bears. And Hallis says, "Sid, I guarantee you'll make the team." And he says, "No, no, no." And Sid's fiancée, Estelle, looks at Hallis and says, "Mr. Hallis, we're not coming to Chicago for $4,000. And so Hallis immediately pulled out another contract for $5,000 and said, "This is the most I've ever paid anybody." And in fact, it was. He'd only paid Red Grange $5,000 a year. So he strong-armed Sid into doing it. And then, and this is another chapter here, when Sid got to the training camp, he was hazed like crazy for being Ivy League, for being Jewish, for not being tough. Most of the Bears of that era were from small towns, coal towns in Pennsylvania, or from the Deep South. They didn't know what to do with this guy. And Sid, they actually went to Hallis during training, a bunch of them, George Musso and some of the other linemen, and said, "You got to get rid of this guy." Dan Topping in Brooklyn, we know, because we read in the papers, Mr. Hallis, "Coach, he offered you $15,000 for Hallis. Take the money. We need it." And Hallis said, He said, "I'm sticking with this guy." And so he did. Against all the odds, Sid, with his very quick mind, learned all these plays and earned finally the respect of these other guys and led the Bears to, 4 NFL championships in 7 years.
Wow, fascinating. Dan
Amazing.
Topping, of course, folks, owned the Yankees and owned Mantle and Maris before he sold it to CBS. So that's who Dan Topping was, who owned Brooklyn in the old NFL way back in the 30s, who wanted Luckman back. You're like this. In 1990, I am doing a sports talk program in New York with my old partner, Mike Francesa. And on December, whatever the date was, we did the 50th anniversary of 73-0. And I don't know if you knew this, Richard. Who do we have on the air together? Sammy Baugh and Sid Luckman.
And Sid? Oh,
and
no.
Sid.
I've got to get that.
Yeah, I don't know where the hell it is. We did it for a half hour, the both of them together on the famous game in 40 in which the Bears beat Washington to win the title 73-0. Everybody knows the score. The game was at Griffith Stadium. Red Barber was the play-by-play guy, if you can imagine that.
Yep.
But they need to know some details, and that's where you come in. Give our audience a little sense. That's a historic game. Everybody knows about the score, but very little about the game. So you have to explain.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Here are just a very few important details. 3 weeks before the championship game, the Bears had a regularly scheduled game at Griffith Stadium, and they were down, I think it was 7-6. Anyway, the Bears were on the Redskins goal line with just a few seconds left. And they call a play where Sid throws it to Ken Cavanaugh, his favorite receiver. But just as the ball's about to reach him, one of the Redskins, one of the defensive backs, grabs Cavanaugh from behind, and he can't catch the ball. And they lose. And Hallis runs off the bench. He was famous for verbally assaulting refs. He couldn't believe it. The game had been stolen from him, and he cried foul. And as a result, the Washington press, on the eve of this rematch in the championship game, called the Bears in headlines whiners and crybabies, really stoking the Bears, inadvertently stoking the Bears, determination. So coming into the game, the Bears were loaded for bear, excuse the expression, and had a lot to prove to themselves. And Hallis kept posting these denigrating headlines in the locker room to get those guys worked up. Now, the night before, speaking of having those two gentlemen on your show in 1990, so in 1940, on the night before the game, the two of them, Baugh and Luckman, appeared on a radio show. And Sid thought Baugh was very cocky, coming across as very cocky, and he reported this to Hallis. And then just before the game, when the Bears left the locker room, Hallis took Luckman aside, gave him an index card with 3 plays on it. He said, "We'll know after you run these 3 plays what kind of defensive mindset they're in for this game." So they didn't have to use the 3 plays because they received the opening kickoff. They ran a run off right tackle. The second play was off left tackle with can't remember. Osmansky.
It was
Bill Osmansky.
Bill Omansky. Right. Go ahead.
Right, Bill Osmansky. So you can see this in the film. Luckman spins, hands off to Osmansky, going around toward left tackle, but that hole closes up, and so he goes wider around left end, and he's much faster than he looks, and he goes 66 yards for a touchdown. And from there on, it's just an incredible route in which everything goes the Bears' way, including a pass from Baugh that was a sure touchdown pass that would have tied the game in the first quarter. But his receiver just dropped the ball. And after that, it was just one thing after another. They intercepted 5 passes. They made Washington look sick. I think the Bears compiled 560 some odd yards. And, famously after the game, somebody asked Baugh, "Gee, if you had scored that touchdown in the first quarter, what do you think the score of the game would have been?" And he said 73-6.
He said that to me 30 years ago. And he said the exact same thing. Now, that game had a lot of impact. Everybody paid attention. The NFL is in its infancy here, still not really doing that well as far as the gate goes. But that game had significant impact there, Richard. Give him some thoughts on that. It meant a lot. That was a huge game. Meant a lot. Had a lot of lasting ramifications. Tell him about that for a sec.
Well, the big one, of course, is that it certified the T formation as a viable offense. Only the Bears were using the T formation. Only the Bears in the NFL. I don't think anybody even was experimenting with it at the college level. And people made fun of it. It's still basically what we see today, except when they're in the shotgun. It's a guy over center, and it's a finesse game with a lot of misdirection, and nobody thought it would work. Everybody was stuck in the single wing thing, which was basically a rushing offense. So the Bears 73-0 victory made everybody look at the T formation a little differently. And by the end of the decade, by 1949, every single NFL team was using the T formation.
Wow.
And you needed a different kind of athlete to make it work. You needed a quarterback.
You needed the quarterback.
Yeah.
Yes, 100%.
You need a quarterback who could pass. Now, Luckman was not quite as deft a passer as Baugh, but Luckman was a great, great field general. Hals, of course, was a great coach. And Luckman had some of these intangibles that, enable you to really win the respect of your team and lead them. I mean, the Bears became virtually unbeatable for the next few years, even though they lost one of those championship games to the Redskins, oddly. But the impact of that game was to make was to modernize the NFL, to make it a game in which passing was as important than running. If you look at the statistics, you'll see the percentage of yards coming from the passing game rose very, very quickly to rival the rushing yards. And teams started looking for clever, fast quarterbacks.
Yeah, the quarterback became the star instead of the big bruising running back based on that game.
Right, because the quarterback in the single wing is essentially a runner. And at Columbia, Sid had been a bruising, quote unquote, bruising runner. He got more bruised than I think he bruised other people. He had his nose broken several times. But in the T formation, you rarely run. You run if you have to scramble out of the pocket or quarterback sneak. Luckman ran once against the Giants in '46. Famous bootleg run during the championship game against the Giants that it's fun to watch because it's a great play. They send everybody to the left. He bootlegs the ball, and from the 12 or 15-yard line, runs it in against the Giants, and he can barely make it to the end zone.
Wow, fascinating. Wow.
So
hang in.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Running quarterback, it became more of a passing league because of that game, which is fascinating with that. All right, more to do. We go back to the Jewish stuff with the mob and Meyer Luckman when we continue with Richard Rosen. Tough Luck, great book, Atlantic Monthly Press. This is for Eric Spitz. We continue here on Mad Dog Unleashed. Don't go away.